Well, welcome everyone. I am Janet Dietrich. I am Senior Managing Director of the Macquarie Group and a member of the International Women's Forum here in Houston, Texas. The IWF is very pleased to bring you this virtual event. It is one in a series highlighting the important work women are doing to address the challenges in their companies and also in their communities. The goal here is to spread their wisdom and inspiration. And today's conversation is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. If everyone, and I'm sure we all do, remember back in May 2020 and the awful events that led to the death of George Floyd, it really underscored that here in the United States and in much of the world, there are still deep divisions that can limit access and can also limit opportunity. Many organizations have pledged to do better and address diversity, promote inclusion, and also champion equity. Some have made important progress in creating a sense of connection, belonging, and opportunity. Chevron has been working on these issues since the 1990s. Although energy and the energy industry has historically been viewed, as I well know, as the domain of white men, at Chevron, it certainly isn't anymore. And so joining me today to discuss the company's success and what we all might take away from it is Josetta Jones, Chevron's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And Josetta, it is so wonderful to have you here today.
Janet, thank you so much. It is just a delight to come to everyone. I love seeing everyone from across, not just the US, but even outside of the US. And so, I think it really speaks volumes about the impact that women can have in organizations and what we have to do collectively, and why it's so important to have organizations like the International Women's Forum, that we have to come together and collaborate and talk about issues, headwinds that we might be facing, and ways that we can eradicate them and make the workplace better for women and for all of us ultimately. So thank you for the discussion. I'm looking forward to and for the questions.
Yep, absolutely. Before we get started, two things. One, there is a Q&A button at the bottom, which this group must be quite familiar with because I'm already getting questions here. So keep the questions coming. I may jump into those questions as we go, but we might just save a lot of those to the end, but feel free to jump in and ask questions. That's the first thing. And the second really important question, as I know that you grew up in Houston, Texas, and you moved into the San Francisco Golden State area, the question on, I'm sure everyone's mind is, who would you rather? Houston Rockets or Golden State Warriors?
Oh, goodness, Janet, that's such a tough question. And when it comes to the playoffs, and they are playing every year, I am always conflicted. One minute, my hands are up for the Rockets. The next minute, I'm cheering for the Warriors. So, I think the best thing is that regardless who wins in that particular game and series and they meet up, I'm always winning because my team is always going to win. And maybe that's a nice PC response.
I was getting ready to say that is a nice balanced response there, Josetta. All right, well, let's just jump into what we were talking about, and especially around Chevron, because I've been in the energy industry for a very, very long time. And I thought I knew Chevron until I started doing a little background on this area. And I can't believe how forward-thinking Chevron has been for so long. What prompted Chevron to tackle diversity and inclusion so long ago?
It's true, Janet, and I can even say for myself, even stepping into this role as the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer, I was unaware of some of the activities that we had going on in the D&I space. And our history really starts back to the 60s. In 1962, we had a statement of what we believe with SoCal. So Standard Oil of Southern California, which is our parents, or was the first parent of Chevron, and we know all about Standard Oil. But one of the things I was thinking about this, one of the things I think that's really helped Chevron is that, one, we are based in the San Francisco Bay Area, when many of the energy and oil and gas companies, petrochemical companies, are based outside of that. They are headquartered in Texas or New Jersey, other places that don't have a rich culture of civic justice and social justice. And so even when we look at what has gone on historically in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have had gay rights movements. We have had, and even extending today, like the LGBTQ plus community rights movements. We talk about women's movements. We talk about the African American movement and the civil rights movement in the 60s, Asian Americans, the first openly gay elected public official was Harvey Milk in San Francisco. And I think that when our headquarters were located in San Francisco, especially, that's what we were breathing. That was just part of what was our fabric. And so it really did enable us to start with the foundation of what we believe, that we are not going to discriminate. Then in 1968, having a really an affirmative program to have minority recruitment, recognizing that bringing all people to the organization can really help to better us. And then even later on in the 90s, putting it into our Chevron way, which is basically our threefold about what we believe, the core values of the company, with the diversity being the top value, diversity and inclusion. And so it just went from there. We have employee networks. The first ones got sanctioned in 1999. We have added same-sex benefits in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, we actually added health benefits for people who want to transition to their best selves and who they are, so those who are transitioning. And so I think that really does set a nice foundation for D&I at Chevron and what we've been doing.
Yep. It's amazing how many programs that you guys have had in the past and how long those programs have been in place and how they've evolved. Mm-hmm. And, as I've been chatting with a number of corporations and private equity and just different individuals in the industry, one of the things, depending on where any company is on their sort of journey in all this, one of the things that seems to be, I'm not sure if you would say a pivotal point or not, was the death around George Floyd. And, maybe a question there is, as everyone here thinks about, their particular companies or whom they work for, was that, as many programs as you guys have had, was that event a pivotal point for Chevron? Was there any kind of resulting refocus or reshape or reinvigoration of the efforts there?
I would say it enabled us to take another look at ourselves to see where we are, because it's really easy to rest on your laurels. And so you're resting on, we've got the Chevron way, we have employee networks. And what we ended up doing is really enhancing some of the programs that we had after the death of George Floyd. But we also started with listening tours. So some of our Black employees met with members of the executive leadership team. They had a listening tour. These employees told their stories about their experiences, not only outside of work, but also professionally, what they've experienced as a Black employee. It was moving for the executives. We continued those learning and listening journeys, and then we ended up having commitments in how we were going to further our interactions with the Black community and our Black talent, shoring up our supplier diversity, so making sure that we really do have diverse suppliers in our business, and not just as it relates to getting drill bits, but other aspects of the business. There's a whole supply chain there. When we look at our talent development internally, we had already been partnering with the Executive Leadership Council, but we expanded that partnership. And so they offer talent development programs throughout the entire talent pipeline. So from very young professionals in the organization to even the most senior professionals in the organizations. We also extended our commitment to some HBCUs. We had histories with historically Black colleges and universities, but we made a commitment to identify 7 historically Black colleges and universities, and over a 5-year period to make a donation to them $1 million apiece.
Yep.
And then our K through 12 involvement, continuing that, we've had a partnership with the East Oakland Youth Development Center, really getting into letting these young individuals know about corporate life, how they can ready themselves for college. A long program with Tech Bridge Girls, that one's near and dear to my heart. It's in the Bay Area and outside of the Bay Area, but what we do, I've volunteered with them since 2003, even before Chevron became one of their donors, but we became one of their donors some years later. And so we've continued that partnership with Tech Bridge Girls, where we introduce STEM curricula and help partner with schools to introduce STEM curricula to girls, particularly who are from communities that might be more socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so we actually have a wide swath, not just African-American girls, but a wide swath of girls. Girls are the important part in that piece. And that really ties in nicely as we develop those girls into professional women, and women eventually who can be part of the International Women's Forum.
So that event was, I guess, about 1.5 years ago. How did, when you think about the timing of that and the fact that, COVID was impacting all of us and all of our organizations, did you see the workforce being able to really get involved and really, sort of rallying around that? And how did you see sort of the pandemic impact what Chevron was trying to, sort of evolve and move forward and reinvigorate? Or
Well, I think
So,
it's the creativity. I mean, that's really when you talk about innovation. When we talk about innovation in organizations, what we look for, because you can't physically go to, we have not been able to physically go to the schools, especially in 2020, late 2020. We were doing a lot of our interactions remotely, as we are still doing. We are having this virtual discussion remotely. One thing I will say is that we recently held a Chevron Energy Innovation Summit with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund with their scholars. And that was all virtual. And we had some scholars come in from the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and they had a problem to solve in a week's time. And they put forth their problem. It was judged and someone was selected. And, also you have scholarships there and other donations. We actually enriched our partnership with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. So now our chief financial officer sits on that board, and we were able to do that in the virtual setting. And those are not the only organizations with whom we've had relationships, but I would say it really did cause us to draw inward. With the Executive Leadership Council, one of the things that we've been able to do is actually send more people to their programs during the pandemic because they're virtual, and so we don't have some of the same cost constraints of physically having to send someone. Not only just cost constraints, but when people have their own schedules, they don't have to worry about being away from their families for a few days at a time. They can attend these virtually during the workday and then come back home at night to be with their families, come back virtually at home to be with their families. So I would say in many ways, the pandemic has enabled us to be creative and to look for solutions as we still continue to drive diversity and inclusion in our organization.
Yep, I actually agree with that. It is the silver lining there is that lots of corporations and lots of people have figured out sort of better ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And I've also seen the ability for lots of folks to participate because it is virtual and you can kind of manage your timing just a little bit better.
You
right?
can, and one thing I'll also add, I mentioned we have employee networks, and we've had starting in 1999 commissioning them. But one of the things that we did with our Black History Month, our Black Employee Network, they actually had a joint celebration in February. Normally, each of the sites where they have Black employee networks, they would have their own individual ones. But this was really nice because everyone in the organization could come to one particular event, and we could really showcase what the Black Employee Network was doing for Black history awareness. And so I think it just really goes to show that we can be very creative in the space of virtual.
Yeah, and creativity sort of brings me to another question. There's so many in so many different corporations. There's so many different diversity initiatives. It sounds like Chevron has, just quite a number of them. How do you figure out what is most impactful? And from a diversity standpoint, how do you think about all the different initiatives and ensuring that they're having the impact and the influence that you want them to have?
Well, that's a big question, and you do wonder about the impact, but we have a global workforce of about 40,000 individuals. And so when you think about working on having an inclusive workplace and a culture of belonging, you know that even small impacts can go a long way. So we have members of our XYZ community, and we had an XYZ Expo. And that was impactful for people. One thing I would say with XYZ that they did is they recommended something that's called the gig marketplace. Now, I recently found out that others have done this, but I think it's still a very creative solution. And what the solution was we can have individuals who have a desire to maybe step outside of their core area of responsibility and lend themselves and their talent to another part of the organization through the gig marketplace. So a position holder will post a gig. They're meant to be short term. They can be a few weeks, a month. They can just read a cold document with cold eyes, provide something, some awareness. And in fact, we're going to put a few gigs out there in our diversity and inclusion ombuds group. But it really is. That's an impact there, and it's probably, you may not even be able to quantify it, because what you're doing is you're giving variety to individuals for their work, but you're also enabling them to build their relationships with others in the organization. And so I think there are always impacts, even if it's just making someone else think about, I didn't realize that, or I've learned something new. There are big impacts like giving scholarships, having students come in. It's not just that we give scholarships to Black students, we have scholarships all across. veterans, we support that. We have
Mhm.
scholarships for Hispanic and the Latin community, Native Americans, others who may not identify with a particular race or ethnicity. And so that's an impact towards somebody's education. And so I think we have to just have the totality of the impact and recognize that all of these programs really do inure to the benefit of making a diverse and inclusive workplace that really does help to establish a culture of belonging.
Yep. And that makes me wonder, empathy and everything that you just talked about, the diversity of individuals and skill sets and cultures, et cetera.
Mhm.
Empathy is really a key factor there. Can you grow empathy? How do you do that in the workplace? How do you tackle?
Yeah, it is. It's really hard because I think sometimes when you use the E word, like empathy, and particularly like a community like Chevron, the oil and gas, and you think about the roughnecks that are out in the field and they're exploring and producing crude, you're like, well, where does empathy come into that?
Yep.
I think we all have a bit of empathy in us, and it's Maya Angelou said it actually, is do we have the courage to actually bring it out? And so when you start to build those relationships, when you start to find something connectivity, I think the best way to start is if you find something where you relate. So you and I talked about the Rockets and the Warriors, and we commiserated before we started the call that the
Wait a minute,
Rockets.
I'm going to draw the line there. No empathy for me.
But that sometimes the Rockets can frustrate us. I'm sorry, frustrate us, Rockets. That there we had a commonality and we could really empathize. So I think it takes a lot on both sides to really get that core connectivity and the empathy. But it helps us to know, okay, Janet told me today that she has been having, I don't know, you had some car issues or something, or you had something that happened in your family that you weren't able to control. And I understand that, but you also had some deadlines. And I'm like, okay, we could reprioritize some work. And it takes really understanding that and really trying to lead with empathy so that you can get the best out of your team. And once you say, Janet, Josetta, I really appreciate what you did for me. Let me know how I can help you in the future. And we really start to have that team bond. We have to normalize empathy. We can't let empathy seem like it is some sort of bad word, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing for cultures to have empathy. And we really just have to work to normalize it. You see it all around. I think what we're seeing right now in pop culture, I think part of the success for, I don't know if you're watching Ted Lasso on.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Do you not love it? But I think, one of the successes about the show and what that whole storyline is that it's drawing on really empathy.
Sure
as we're finding out, the coach has his own issues that he's dealing with, but he came in with empathy, and it had been really probably a really tough organization in itself. Even the owner of the organization, she's softened up. And it's not that empathy is related to softening, but it really is relating to understanding what people in your organization, your friends and family are going through.
Yep. Oh, couldn't agree more. By the way, I love that show. I just can't wait for the next episode. Yes, I'm too caught up now. I'm waiting for the next one.
Apple knows what they're doing not to drop them all at once, because
no
we're
kidding.
On edge.
No kidding. Yes, so empathy, really, really key in all this, I think. So a lot of people, and especially more historically, when you use the word diversity, the immediate first thought is it's about race. But, I've experienced this over time, and I know you have too, cognitive diversity, and how Chevron is thinking about diversity and thinking about cognitive diversity. I didn't actually realize there was a label for it, and I believe in this in a quite a significant way. Can you talk about that a little bit? Talk about what it is, so everyone that's listening, if they don't know, how we define that, and talk about how you guys kind of think about that, in the workplace.
Right. And that's a great point, Janet. I'll just even back up a little bit, is that a lot of times when you say diversity, people automatically do think it's visible diversity. So race, ethnicity, gender. But we like to say here in my organization that there are 6 dimensions of diversity, and kind of bucketed together. And one of those buckets is cognitive diversity. So how do people problem solve? They might problem solve differently. We know that there are individuals who may be on the spectrum, but they are super sharp at what they do, and they just approach a problem differently, and they can get amazing results. And our organization decided to bring in some individuals who were cognitively diverse into our IT organization, information technology organization. And they had internships with us. We had 5 individuals, and they performed. In fact, we ended up extending offers to 4 of the 5 to come work with us. And I think it just really goes to show the necessity of not discounting anyone because they may not have the same sort of approach or perspective about problem solving as you. The other thing with respect to, I think, the success of this particular program is that when we brought the individuals in as interns, they had a mentor, which we all know the power of mentorship. They had a buddy, but a little bit different than a mentor, but somebody to make sure that you're, making it to the, I guess in this case, the virtual events. And then we also coached the supervisors, because it's really key to understanding and building that empathy and awareness with the supervisors to recognize that these employees, that they may not approach a problem in the same way. And that doesn't mean that their approach is wrong. It just means that it is different from yours.
Mm-hmm. Chevron is a global company. And in thinking about, diversity and all of the employee base, all the different jurisdictions that not only Chevron is in, but many of the companies that we all work for are global and in lots of jurisdictions and lots of communities. How do you customize the approach around different cultures and different, just the different jurisdictions that you're having to sort of think about?
Right. It's a great question, because certain aspects of the 6 dimensions of diversity don't all play out everywhere. So whereas we have rights here in the US for same-sex marriage, and other parts of the world that might be taboo. And so we definitely don't want to go against what the norm is and the cultural norm and what's expected in those areas. But we do look at the differences in culture. So for example, in Nigeria, you may not necessarily need a Black employee network because the majority of the workforce might identify as from the African continent, or everyone looks like you. But you have tribal differences. And I was talking with a colleague who had spent some time in Nigeria, and this is really interesting because in those tribal differences, some of the underrepresented tribes may have not necessarily gotten jobs. You want to make sure that you are including a swath. And the other thing is, part of those tribal differences, even if you were in the same tribe, somebody in that tribe might have a higher standing, but when you come to work, you're kind of on a level playing field. And so the story that was shared with me is that there was an individual on a team, and this gentleman who was the manager asked him, hey, go and speak to so-and-so. Sam, go speak to Peter about this matter and ask him to do this, this, and this. Went back to the manager, and the manager said, did you speak to him, Sam? And Sam said, not yet, I'm getting to it. Well, what eventually happened, finally Sam said, well, I'm having a really hard time asking Peter to do this because Peter is higher ranked in our tribe than I, and it's very uncomfortable for me to talk to him about that. But when we have, and this is why it's so important to break down some of these hierarchical issues as well, because when we have that, it can lead to severe consequences. When we talk about the Asiana flight that crashed in San Francisco some years ago, one of the issues is that the pilot was more senior, and the junior pilots knew that they were coming in a little bit too low and it was going to be kind of detrimental, but they didn't want to speak up and say anything. And as it turned out, the airplane did, come in not at the right level, and it actually crashed. Fortunately, there were many survivors, although there were a couple of people who did perish, but it shows the real consequences of not having the comfort and ability to get over some of those aspects with respect to different types of diversity, and in that case, hierarchical diversity.
Got it. So I'm gonna break away and pull in a couple questions here because they're very specific to kind of what we're talking about, and I'm afraid we'll lose the moment a bit if I don't. So the first question is, in your position, can you share with us how your office is helping Chevron employees of color deal with trauma from the racial reckoning in our communities? And I'm thinking about that communities maybe in the US, but also globally. And that kind of goes back to different jurisdictions and how certain areas and certain jurisdictions feel based on what they're dealing with. How does Chevron sort of toggle, with all that?
Exactly. And you're absolutely right, Janet, different communities, because we have not just offices, we have business, very vibrant business in Australia. And we actually have a racial reckoning plan in Australia. Now, it took some time to get there, but we have it. And we have programming to that. We have had discussions like panel discussions on reparations and racial reconciliation. And so exposing it and sharing it, we did share that particular panel across the enterprise so that there was an opportunity to learn a little more about that. But also even internally, if you don't want to have a public forum and we've even done real talk, which is we've had employees of different diverse groups, racial and ethnic diversity, have a few segments on real talk and what they've experienced, and we've been showing those at work, just videos that we've put together and produced in the Diversity and Inclusion Ombuds Office. But the other piece, which I think is really critical, and I'm understanding that not all organizations have this, we have an ombuds office, and you can go to the ombuds person and talk about anything. We have a very talented team. We also have employee assistance professionals, and they're very good. So if you don't want to have a very vocal conversation or have others part of the conversation, you can go to them and talk to them about issues of racial reckoning. But it is an ongoing, it's ongoing. It's never ending because it impacts us differently, and there can be a triggering event. And so the key, I really think, is community, and to really lean in and lead with empathy. We have had discussions with the executive leadership team, and not only just discussions, but in 2018, our chairman, Mike Wirth, he's a fantastic chairman. He does an amazing job, but he stood up the Inclusion Council. And so the network presidents, we have 12 networks, they all meet with Mike and his ELT 3 times a year, and they bring forward issues that are impacting each of their networks. So that's another opportunity for us to kind of get to the channels of what's impacting and at the highest levels in the organization. And so through programming that we don't have any specific, I would say, when you talk about, we don't have any specific circles or group circles devoted to racial reconciliation, but we do have individual resources that you can use. And as mentioned, outside of the US and Australia, we have a more robust interaction with respect to racial reconciliation.
And you bring up the Mike Wirth and what they're doing from a senior standpoint. The buy-in and the leading by example at the top is important.
It is.
It's very important.
It is very important.
So let's switch a tiny bit here and just talk about the fact that politics really seem to, add into sort of diversity and the political dimension there. How, whether it's Chevron or other corporations, has Chevron faced pushback from employees or customers around all of this and around, that sort of a political dimension in diversity?
I think there's always going to be pushback when something makes people feel uncomfortable and maybe they don't understand why. And that's why it's important to have the why. This year, I've been in role for 8 months as Chevron's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And so I'm going through a lot of firsts in my year because it is my first year. And so I had my first year with respect to Pride Month as the CDIO. And what we do at Chevron is we will raise the Pride flag around our locations around the world where it's permissible, where we're not going against any sort of norms. And so I've had a couple of people ask me, well, Josetta, how do you feel about that? And when are we going to, I've heard like, when are we going to take the Pride flag down? Because, I just can't get with that. And I said, when I see the Pride flag, so even kind of going back, because that can have some political aspects as well with respect to LGBTQ plus rights. I told them, I said, when I see the Pride flag, I don't just see it as a beacon for people who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. What I see is that everyone is welcome, that if we are willing to fly a flag and say, you're welcome here, that's just not for the members of the LGBTQ plus community, but it's for all of us. And so having those dialogues, I think I even go back, Janet, back to when Coke decided to change its formula and come out with the new Coke. And there was a lot of pushback there. And so, and then they had to go back to the old Coke. There. Right. So they had to go back to the old Coke. But I think it just goes to show that whenever you do something that has not always been, cut and dry in the same sort of direction that you're having things, you're kind of stepping outside of the norm, that you'll get pushback. And in many ways, when I hear that, it means that we're doing something right, that we are really having people think. And it's not the same as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I think about the abolitionists all those years ago, that if somebody didn't step up and there was a lot of pushback back then, we wouldn't be where we are today. I wouldn't be in this position.
So I've got a couple questions from the
Okay.
participants that also add into another question that came in. So I'm going to try to kind of pack them all together. And it seemed it sort of centers around not only the existing workforce and the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion to the existing workforce, but also in recruiting. And whether you're recruiting senior staff or junior staff, do you find that many people in general, young people, more experienced, do they prioritize working for companies with a commitment to DE&I? How much does that factor in these days, do you think?
Well, I would say now, Janet, that's a real thing. Generation Z, they want to, I mean, they've come up in a community where, as somebody told me, they can have friends all over the world. And they can do it just from their cell phones or their computers because we have these applications that connect them, that socially connect them. And so they are seeing a more diverse world and they want to see that. They want to see that there's diversity, inclusion in the workplace and equity. I think it's a pivotal point for all of us. Right now, we have 4 generations in the workplace. We have the baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z, and we all have to work together. And I don't think it's a bad thing that the younger generations are challenging the establishment to say, this is what we expect, and that it really makes us a richer organization. And not to mention, we're all around the world.
Oh, absolutely. So this is not meant to be a provocative question, but the question is around Chevron believing that addressing issues on diversity in its workforce, does it have an impact on the bottom line? How does all of this and all of the efforts, how does it impact the bottom line? And how do we measure that? I'm all about measuring and verifying and transparency. How do you measure that? How do you know it's working? What metrics do you use?
Right. So we don't have any established metrics, I would say. We do have aspirational goals for a diverse and inclusive workplace. But one of the things, the examples, prior to my role as being CDIO, I worked for Chevron. I've been here almost 20 years as a patent attorney and ultimately managing our IP law group. But so I was involved in a lot of research, and I would see diversity in our research teams. And one of our most successful products, Chevron with Techron, which is a fuel additive. Right. Actually, the inventors of that is a diverse team. We have, a white man who is a researcher, and then also we have a Black man who's one of the key contributors and researchers and the patent holders, inventors for that particular product. It's been wildly successful for Chevron, and we've had a patented advantage for many, many years. And I like to think that because we've had that diversity of the team, in this case, we had some probably diversity of schools as well as we had visible diversity, that they bring their perspective and enable us to provide innovative products. And we see that across our research and development facility. We have employees from all races and diversities and genders. And I think it just really enables you to have some creative thinking. And so when you talk about the dollar line, we may not have known what would have happened if one of the inventors, Jack Morris, had not been an inventor of Techron, but we do know what happened and that he was an inventor along with Rich Turpek, and that they actually were able to give us a product that really did put us at the forefront with respect to this particular fuel additive technology.
So that leads to what I think is a really important question. You've got Chevron, my firm, everyone probably out there would probably say the same thing. There's so much talent and skill sets and individuals, in the workforce. How do you ensure that everyone has a voice at the table? So you're leveraging off of, all the different skill sets and all the different talents and everyone's perspective. How do you pull that together?
That can be a real challenge, Janet. And I don't think there's an easy answer, because there are those of us who might feel like we're not getting our voice, but building relationships is really key to making sure that your voice is heard, and having the right ones and speaking your truth, speaking about not only your skill sets and what you have, but how your vision to speak up and not be afraid. In fact, right before we started, I was talking with one of the ladies on my team, and we were talking about someone who recently attended our executive leadership council program. She went and she said, wow, I was really invigorated. She told the person on my team, I was really invigorated. Thanks for recommending that I attend. And in fact, when my boss was asking me about another opportunity, I told him, well, I really want to stick with this because I'm on this particular track. And so she felt empowered, and that's part of it with making sure you have the voice at the table. So she may not be in that room, but she spoke to her supervisor about what she considered as her career projective. And he said, you're absolutely right. I can appreciate that and I can understand that, and let's keep going. So it's really leveraging the relationships that you have, because the table is so big. There's room for everyone at the table, or at least our representatives, but we have to make sure that our representatives know what we're thinking, what we're doing. And that's the power of networking, building relationships, and getting your perspective across to many people. As we know, oftentimes, Janet, too, deals aren't always made in that deal room. Sometimes they're made.
No, that's right. That's
They're
right.
not always made around that table. Sometimes that conversation has gone on. A lot of times the conversations have gone on before you even get to the table. And so you have to position yourself so that you're able to have that conversation, so that what you want represented at that table comes out. And that's part of that networking and that savvy there.
Yeah, and so it's like, to play it back to you, it sounds like having that bottoms up organic sort of approach, but also having a bit of that top down and leading by example and bringing those together, is really really more of a recipe for success, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So this question is kind of touches on that. Maybe we can see if we can round it out a bit, but the question is, as we think about building inclusive work environments, how do you make a workplace more approachable to the cognitively diverse, workforce that you have? How do you make it more approachable? Are there things that a company can do, or, obviously you've talked a little bit about, the culture at Chevron, but are there other things that a company can do to make it more approachable?
You have to start with training. And I mean, training, not the person who's cognitively diverse, but really making others who may not be cognitively diverse aware of the opportunities and what it means to be cognitively diverse. Because when you understand and when you've learned more about, it could be cognitive diversity, it could be many things that you don't identify with, and you have a better understanding of that. And so I really think that awareness starts, and we're able to use here at Chevron, we're able to use our employee networks for part of that training. We also have diversity councils within the business for part of that training, and then just kind of individual. So we have to feel comfortable. And once you have that comfort level in psychological safety in an organization, you feel comfortable speaking up, you can say, hey, well, let me share with you my experience, or let me share with you the experience of my child who has cognitive diversity. And I really think that opens the aperture for people to understand what it is like to be, in this case, cognitively diverse.
Yeah, and I don't know how many of the participants out there have employee network groups, et cetera, but I think they're terrific. I think they're powerful. I think they really represent so much of the diverse staff across jurisdictions, and I just think they're a real important part of corporations these days, of any entity. And on that, another question just popped up. We're going to go back a little bit, but I've had a couple others around this. Thank you guys all for the questions. But this is around specifically, I think you mentioned this early on, Chevron's 6 pillars of diversity. Are there 6 pillars that Chevron has? And can you maybe touch on those a bit?
Right. So these are out there on the internet. They're not.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Chevron. Right. They're out there on the internet, but really it just, it identifies that you might have diversity. Like we mentioned before, you have diversity, race, ethnicity, gender, age, but then kind of moving into familial status. So, whether you're married or single, how you approach a problem, being an introvert or an extrovert, your cultural diversity. And so putting all of those together, and it's just something that we like to use at Chevron, but it's out there. We didn't come up with it. Let me say, I'll put it out there. If you do like a quick little search for 6 dimensions of diversity, and you'll see lots of different aspects of diversity that are included. And what it's really saying is that we all have an aspect of diversity. And it could be your religious diversity, but we all have an aspect of diversity that really adds to the culture of an organization.
So I've got a question here. I'm not going to shy away from provocative questions, but I'm not sure you have an answer for this, and I don't think I have an answer for this, but I'm going to ask anyway. And this comes from Zorinka. She's saying, I'm seeing some companies, and I haven't seen this, although I know we're going to connect with this. I'm seeing some companies removing chief from their titles, with because of sensitivity and respect to Native Americans. Quite frankly, I haven't seen this yet. Have you seen this?
Well, I will see some organizations, they'll have a director of diversity. They will have a head of diversity inclusion. And it's not just for diversity inclusion. I think that's a really good point as we start to really think about some of what's been adopted in our culture by calling chief. Now, the other thing is, yes, in the Native American culture, but also you'll have chiefs outside of the U.S. So in tribals, and there's still tribes.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
Like
That's right.
But like in Africa,
Right.
you will have tribes there, and you will have the chief of the tribe. It's been so indoctrinated, I would say, the word chief in corporate America, because it's not just chief diversity inclusion officer. You have chief IP counsel. You have oh goodness, you have chief human resources officer. And so I think that's a great look for corporate America to look at. What are we doing to not have any sort of, bring in any sort of the stereotypes or misappropriation from other cultures in our titles? So thanks for that question. It is provocative, and it has me think, and I know that members of my team are participating. They're watching, and so I know that we'll take that down and we'll have a discussion about it, kind of a roundtable, and see what we want to promote. But I think that's a great example.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Just the different aspects of all of this, and the things that, all of a sudden you don't think about, and then someone asks a question and it crops up and you go, I haven't really thought about that. Let's think about that, right?
It's true. Yeah, it's true. But you said Zareen said it. Zareen.
Zarinka.
Zarinka.
I'll probably butcher that name, but
I'll say Miss V. So we talk about, because you have like the not the Kansas City Chiefs. Which team? We had Washington. They renamed.
Oh, they changed their name.
They changed their name, and so you're seeing that there are recognitions that some of these names that we've long had, these were mascots, but still it's the same sort of example. These are mascots, and as we start to progress, and really I would say just our own understanding and awareness, and being cognizant, just being really aware of what's going on and what the history has been. There it is, Zarinka Allen. Everyone calls you Z. All right, thank you, Z.
You're welcome.
But it does. It's an awareness that we need to have brought forward, and we saw it with respect to mascots. And I don't know why you can't see the same sort of approach with respect to corporate America and to organizations. And I know, I think it was Google, they have, and others have it too, but it's a head. Is it a head people officer, or maybe people? It's like people. They've like taken every attribute of what has been traditionally done with respect to the role of the human resources, the head of human resources, and they there's like the people person, basically, like the head people person.
People, talent, and culture, I think is
absolutely.
Yeah. So here's a question. How do you feel, from Susan, how do you balance, back to empathy? And I've got a couple of questions here on empathy. How do you balance empathy for an employee's personal situation with meeting expectation for job responsibilities? And certainly in COVID and with this pandemic, that is, on the forefront of a lot of people's minds these days. How do you think about that?
And I do, and I think about it a lot. And so I think we really have to be intuitive, and we also have to lean in to ourselves and then lean out to others. And we have to come from, I would say that we really need to approach employees and their personal situations from a point of best interest, like not just best interest, that's the wrong word, from a point of best intent, so that they're not coming to try to get over, but they are really going through something, and employees are. It's been a tough 18, 19 months, and we're still trying to make it through it. So we need to ask for grace, and we need to give grace. I know I've asked people, I said, please give me the grace that you want me to give you. And when we put it in that sort of frame of reference, it's like, yeah, somebody does want you to give a little bit of grace. And I like to think that we are moving towards that we are moving towards a world that's more empathetic. It doesn't always seem it every day, but I really do believe that we have to be the change that we want to see. And sometimes it does start with that. And sometimes it starts with calling it out. Sometimes it starts with calling out like, well, why are you being so still in the blank? But as leaders, as individuals and organizations, as part of the team, and we see that somebody is really going through it, I think we just have to step up and say, hey, let me help you. I'm here to help you.
I think that may be another reason, I totally agree with you, how everything is just evolving, and we're seeing more thinking about grace and kindness. And I think that might be why the Ted Lasso series is really sort of, really becoming, such a talked about show. So we are getting short on time. I am going to ask, there's a couple more questions here, a couple more questions that have come in. I'm trying to get to them all. This one, actually two of them. are around sort of interviewing and thinking about, diversity and equity and inclusion, and how, when folks are interviewing in the corporate world, how do you get everyone appreciative and thinking about DE&I in that interview process? Is it training? Is it,
It's training. Organizations have to be very intentional. And
yes.
at Chevron, in addition to just interviewing and being intentional and wanting to have diverse slates for interviews, what we did last year, we have an internal process that's our, it's the PDC, but you have jobs that come up and you can interview for them, and people will speak on your behalf. But when you have interviews and we have selection events, we include an inclusion counselor. And this is new since last year. We went through a reorg.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is, because this person's been trained, and we have training. I went through the training myself last week, but we have training, and we have designated inclusion counselors, and they're from different parts of the organization. And so when you're having selection events, you have that inclusion counselor sit on the team, listen to the conversation. So if it seems like somebody is saying, we'd love for Janet to take this role, but she has 3 young children and this is going to be an expat assignment, I don't think she can go. The inclusion counselor would say, well, you shouldn't make that decision about Janet. That has nothing to do with her qualifications for this role. And so they're the ones who are like the referees there. And so it really does bring that awareness. I'm really proud that we have established these inclusion counselors. We are just a year in with having them, so I don't know if we can really determine the success, but I think if anything else, that it causes people to speak up and to call, to call out, like, this is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting that you guys have done that. It will be interesting to see how you feel about the impact of that and the influence of that over the next, 1 to 2 to 3 years, sort of in the future.
And Janet, I want to add something else to that, is that it didn't just start with us having an inclusion counselor. When you talk about D&I, we started several years ago partnering with the Catalyst organization. And we developed a program that's called MARC, which stands for Men Advocating Real Change. And we started with large, so you had same gender workshops, and you had your teams, your cohort together, and you started a couple-year process, but you started together, so the same gender. Then you came together in mixed gender. And what it was is that you were supposed to have these conversations. You built comfort and you have trust, but you have conversations about some of the headwinds that women face in the workplace. And so that's to help, really partner with the men to say, maybe you don't realize this is what we're going through or what we've experienced, and that you can speak up when you see non-inclusive behavior. We've actually even taken that one step further. You talk about training and programs, and we've now created a program called Elevate. So you're elevating the conversations with respect to other aspects of diversity, and they are all based upon one of our 12 employee networks. And so that's another way, and it starts really foundationally, so that when you get to having selection events and you get to having an inclusion counselor, that person has gone through some sort of awareness, education, and training to be able to point out and say, that was something that was a headwind you're putting up for Janet to be able to get the position for an expat assignment.
All right, so we're going to wrap this up now. Last question for you, with all the participants on the call here, what would be your words of advice to the different individuals in all the different cities and states and countries? What would be your words of advice to others who are hoping and wanting to make a difference with DEI in their workplace? What would you say they need to think about? I
would just say that, it doesn't have to be grand, that every effort that you make makes an impact. And it could be one person. It could even be, reading a book about a different culture and sharing that book with somebody else. It could be participating in your network. It could be participating and volunteering outside of the organization. The work is hard in the D&I space. And as a matter of fact, I actually have I've kind of put boundaries around myself. So I really don't like to talk about D&I outside of work, because it's very evolved, be very emotionally involved, because you are really hearing what people go through and impact on all sides. And so I think you have to just come in with the best of intentions, know that you may not get the movement that you want, but that sometimes you're just planting a seed. And as we know, seeds they might be underground for a while, like bulbs, and then they'll pop up in the spring, but you are planting that seed, and it takes all of us collectively to move diversity and inclusion forward.
That is a great final thought there, Josetta. Chevron has had just enormous success. It is truly amazing. I never had any idea all the programming and all the training and the culture that Chevron's had I was actually, to be honest, I was amazed. I couldn't believe I was reading about the energy industry, even though so many companies have made so much headway. It is terrific to see what Chevron's done. And Josetta, thank you. This has been a terrific 45 or 50 minutes here, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having us. We'd be delighted to come back.
You bet. And thank you to everyone else who is participating and joining us on the call here. Just a reminder, there's going to be more standalone virtual events that are in the pipeline. And of course, the IWF Virtual World Leadership Conference is coming up. There will be the much loved dine arounds on October 28th, and we hope you will be with us on November 4th as we discuss a bold new paradigm. We have a great lineup of speakers who will explore the economy, medicine, cybersecurity, education, and more. So we hope everyone will be there. I am Janet Dietrich, and it was a pleasure to be with you today. Bye, Josetta. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.